Karoline Leavitt arrived at the studio early that morning, her confidence unwavering as she prepared for yet another live interview. The set was bright, the cameras positioned strategically, and the well-known liberal host sat comfortably behind his desk, flashing the same rehearsed smile he always did before a heated debate. Karoline had been through this before. She knew how these interviews worked. The media's tactics were predictable. They would start with polite introductions, ease into seemingly neutral questions, and then, when she least expected it, the real attacks would begin. As she adjusted her microphone, a producer walked up to her with a last-minute rundown. "They'll touch on policy, then shift to your latest campaign statements." "Nothing too surprising," he assured her. Karoline simply nodded, knowing full well that what was said in private rarely matched what happened once the cameras rolled. Within minutes, the countdown began. The studio audience fell silent. The bright red live indicator lit up, and the host turned to Karoline with a smirk. "Welcome, Karoline. Let's get right to it." She smiled politely, bracing herself for what was to come. The interview started off predictably. The host leaned forward, maintaining a facade of professionalism, his voice smooth and calculated. "Karoline, you've been quite vocal about your stance on free speech and media bias. But don't you think that sometimes strong rhetoric can do more harm than good?" Karoline knew this game. A subtle attempt to paint her as reckless, to frame her words as dangerous rather than principled. She met his gaze calmly. "I believe strong rhetoric is necessary when the media deliberately distorts the truth. When journalists misrepresent facts to fit a narrative, it's our duty to call them out," she responded confidently. The host smirked, as if he had expected that answer. He glanced at his notes, ready to steer the conversation in another direction. "Interesting. But let's talk about your recent remarks on government overreach. Many have said your position is extreme, even inflammatory. How do you respond to that criticism?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, unfazed. "Extreme? Standing up for personal freedom is now extreme? I find it fascinating that defending individual rights is seen as radical, while expanding government control is framed as progress." A ripple of murmurs could be heard in the audience. The host shifted uncomfortably, but pressed on. "But don't you think," he continued, "that your words can fuel division? That leaders should be more careful in how they express their views?" Karoline smiled, sensing the trap. "I think leaders should be honest, not careful. If the truth divides people, then perhaps the problem isn't the truth, it's those who are afraid of it." The host hesitated for a split second, his carefully planned approach hitting an unexpected wall. The energy in the room shifted. He had expected Karoline to be defensive, to stumble under pressure. Instead, she was composed, sharp, and completely in control. It was only the beginning, and already, things weren't going as the host had planned. The host's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment before he forced another smirk. He shuffled his notes, as if searching for a better angle to regain control of the conversation. "Well, Karoline, that's certainly an interesting perspective," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "But let's be honest, your party has been accused of spreading misinformation. Many fact-checkers have called some of your statements misleading. Would you be willing to admit that sometimes you might be wrong?" Karoline recognized the tactic immediately. A blanket accusation with no specific examples, designed to put her on the defensive. She didn't take the bait. "I find it amusing that the people who define misinformation are the same ones who get caught misleading the public over and over again," she said, her tone unwavering. "The difference between me and the media is that when I state my views, I stand by them. I don't hide behind so-called fact-checkers who twist words to fit a pre-approved narrative." The host's smile tightened. He hadn't expected her to push back so directly. "So, are you saying that journalists should not hold politicians accountable?" he asked, his tone shifting to faux concern. "Not at all," Karoline replied smoothly. I believe in accountability for everyone. But what we see today isn't journalism. It's activism disguised as reporting. And when so-called journalists enter the political arena, they should be prepared to be held accountable too. A few audience members clapped, which visibly irritated the host. He cleared his throat, pretending not to notice. "All right, let's switch gears," he said quickly, as if eager to move past the growing tension. "You've made headlines recently with your strong stance against government control. Some have said your position is unrealistic. Do you really believe that reducing government intervention is the solution to our nation's problems?" Karoline folded her hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "I don't just believe it, I know it. History proves it. Every time government oversteps, the people suffer. And the real question we should be asking isn't whether my stance is extreme, but rather, why do so many politicians believe Americans are incapable of making their own choices?" The host let out a short, forced laugh, but his expression betrayed his frustration. He had planned to trap her into a defensive answer, but instead, she had flipped the script. And now, he was the one struggling to keep up. The host's fingers tightened around his cue cards as he realized Karoline wasn't rattled. She was in complete control. His usual tactics weren't working, and the subtle frustration in his posture was beginning to show. "Well, Karoline," he said, forcing another rehearsed smile, "since you're so confident in your stance, let's talk specifics. You've spoken out against government intervention in businesses. Yet, you support policies that some would argue restrict certain freedoms. Isn't that a contradiction?" Karoline arched an eyebrow. "Give me an example," she said plainly. The host blinked. He hadn't expected that. He glanced down at his notes and cleared his throat. "Well, for instance, your stance on social media regulation. You've criticized tech giants for censoring speech, but wouldn't regulating them be an example of government overreach?" Karoline didn't hesitate. Regulation and protection are not the same thing. The government's job isn't to micromanage companies, but it is supposed to protect citizens' constitutional rights. When private entities act as an extension of the government to suppress free speech, they become part of the problem. And if they're going to benefit from government protections, they should be held to the same constitutional standards. The audience murmured again. The host forced a small chuckle, attempting to dismiss her point. "So, you're saying that private companies shouldn't have control over their own platforms?" "I'm saying they shouldn't be allowed to manipulate public discourse while pretending to be neutral," Karoline shot back. "You don't get to claim you're a platform for free speech while secretly silencing voices that challenge your narrative." The host's jaw tensed. He leaned forward slightly, trying to regain his upper hand. "But don't you think that allowing all speech, especially speech that some might consider dangerous, creates an unsafe environment for people?" Karoline's expression didn't change. Unsafe for whom? For the people in power who don't like being questioned? Or for the everyday Americans who are tired of being told what they can and can't say? Silence hung in the air. For the first time, the host had nothing to say. He had expected Karoline to stumble, to second-guess herself, but instead, she had thrown his own argument back at him. And the tension in the room made it clear. Everyone knew it. The silence stretched for just a second too long, and the host knew he had to act quickly. His eyes flickered toward the producers offstage, as if searching for a lifeline. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. Karoline wasn't just holding her ground. She was dominating the conversation. Forcing another smile, the host leaned back slightly in his chair, adopting a more casual posture, as if trying to downplay the moment. "All right, Karoline," he said smoothly. "Let's talk about leadership. Many people admire your bold stance, but there are critics who say you're simply following in the footsteps of others, rather than bringing fresh ideas to the table. How do you respond to that?" Karoline didn't flinch. Following in the footsteps of whom, exactly? The host hesitated. "Well, you've been compared to several prominent conservative figures. By whom?" Karoline interrupted, her voice calm but firm. The host cleared his throat, clearly not expecting her to push back. Wow, by members of the media, analysts. Karoline tilted her head slightly, an amused smile touching her lips. Ah, so journalists and political insiders are deciding who I am before I even get to speak for myself. A few soft chuckles rippled through the audience. Karoline leaned forward slightly, keeping her gaze locked on the host. The truth is, strong leadership isn't about who you remind people of, it's about what you stand for. I'm not here to fit into a pre-approved narrative. I'm here to fight for the values I believe in. If that makes me similar to someone else in the eyes of the media, so be it. But I don't take orders from talking points, and I certainly don't let the press define who I am. The audience reaction was instant. A few people even clapped, something the producers clearly hadn't planned for. The host's expression stiffened. His goal had been to undermine Karoline's credibility, to make her seem like just another politician recycling old talking points. Instead, she had flipped the argument, turning it into a statement of independence and conviction. He glanced down at his cards, realizing that his best angles had already been countered. It was becoming painfully obvious that Karoline wasn't the one struggling to keep up. He was... And the worst part? They were only halfway through the interview. The host's carefully curated demeanor was beginning to crack. His usual strategy, guiding the conversation in a way that put his guest on the defensive, was failing. Karoline wasn't just answering his questions. She was dismantling the premise behind them. He let out a forced chuckle, attempting to regain his composure, while Karoline lets move on to something else. A lot of people say that your views are divisive, that instead of bringing people together, you're actually deepening the divide in this country. What do you say to that? Karoline crossed her arms on the table, maintaining steady eye contact. It's funny how divisive has become the go-to word whenever someone challenges the mainstream narrative. The truth is, real unity doesn't come from forcing people to agree. It comes from allowing open debate. And right now, the only people deepening the divide are the ones who think disagreement should be silenced instead of discussed. The host blinked, caught off guard by her response. So, you're saying that there's no problem with the growing political tension in this country? I'm saying that tension isn't caused by people having different opinions. It's caused by the people who refuse to let those opinions be heard. A noticeable shift rippled through the audience. The host sensed it too, and his grip on the conversation was slipping. He quickly flipped through his cards, as if searching for a way to redirect the interview. His tone grew sharper, more aggressive. But surely, Karoline, you can acknowledge that words have consequences. Politicians, media figures, people in power, they all influence public perception. Isn't there some responsibility to be more careful with rhetoric? Karoline raised an eyebrow. And who decides what's careful? You? The media? The same people who push narratives without evidence, who twist words to fit an agenda. If we only allow speech that's been sanitized and approved by those in charge, then we don't have free speech at all. The host's lips pressed into a thin line. That sounds a lot like an excuse to say whatever you want, without accountability. Karoline's smile was razor sharp. No, that sounds a lot like the First Amendment. The audience reaction was immediate murmurs, a few nods, even scattered applause. The host's frustration was becoming more evident by the second. He knew this interview was slipping away from him. And now, his next move would determine whether he could regain control or if Karoline would continue to dismantle every question thrown her way. The host's grip on the interview was slipping, and he knew it. He had come prepared with questions designed to put Karoline on the defensive, but each time she flipped the script on him. The frustration was becoming visible now, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way he shifted in his chair, as if trying to physically reposition himself back in control. "All right, Karoline," he said, exhaling sharply as he reshuffled his cue cards. "Let's talk about something else." You've built a reputation for being outspoken, but some have accused you of being intentionally confrontational. Do you think being so combative is really the best way to make a difference?" Karoline let out a quiet chuckle. "That's an interesting way to phrase it. Because when someone on the left pushes back against the establishment, they're called brave. But when a conservative does it, we're confrontational." The audience reaction was immediate. A few nods, some murmurs, even the sound of a chuckle from someone off camera. The host visibly stiffened. "Well," he pressed on, "it's not just about being conservative. It's about the way you deliver your message. Some have said your rhetoric is too aggressive, that it fuels division rather than discussion." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "I find it fascinating that the same people who lecture us about aggressive rhetoric have no problem with the way conservatives are spoken about in the media. You don't seem to have an issue when certain networks use fear tactics to discredit people like me. But when we push back, suddenly it's a problem." The host forced another thin smile. "It's about tone, Karoline. Words matter." She nodded. "You're absolutely right. Words do matter. That's why I choose mine carefully. I don't use fear-mongering. I don't manipulate facts to fit a narrative. I simply tell the truth, and if that makes people uncomfortable, maybe they should ask themselves why." The tension in the room was now thick enough to cut with a knife. The host was out of his element, and Karoline knew it. He cleared his throat, glancing at the teleprompter for guidance. "So, let's move on," he said quickly. "What's next for you? Are you considering a future presidential run?" It was a clear attempt to shift the conversation, to steer away from the fact that he was losing control. But Karoline wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. She leaned back slightly, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Oh, I think we still have plenty to talk about." And just like that, she took back control once again. The host's attempt to shift the conversation had failed again. Karoline wasn't going to let him dictate the terms of this discussion, and everyone watching could see it. The usual formula, where the guest stumbled over a defensive response while the host steered the narrative, had been completely reversed. He forced another smile, clearly trying to maintain some level of composure. "Well, Karoline," he said, adjusting his tie, "since you seem eager to continue this discussion, let's address another issue. Many critics say that people like you thrive on controversy rather than solutions. Do you actually want to solve problems or just stir the pot?" Karoline let out a soft laugh and shook her head. "You know, I always find it funny when people in the media say that, because you don't seem to have a problem with controversy when it benefits you." The host frowned slightly, not liking where this was headed. "I mean, let's be honest," Karoline continued, leaning forward. "Your network, along with others, thrives on outrage. Every night, millions of people tune in to watch selective outrage being pushed as news. You amplify every mistake a conservative makes while excusing or outright ignoring the failures of those you align with. And yet, when someone like me pushes back, suddenly I'm stirring the pot? Seems a little hypocritical, don't you think?" The audience's reaction was noticeable. There were nods, whispers, even a few scattered claps before they quickly quieted down. The host, sensing the energy shift, was clearly irritated. "That's not what I'm saying," he tried to clarify, his voice slightly tighter now. "I'm simply asking if your approach is truly about creating solutions or just making headlines." Karoline tilted her head. "Here's the thing. When someone on the left is vocal, they're called activists, changemakers, or even visionaries. But when conservatives speak out, we're called controversial or divisive. Why is that?" The host hesitated. He knew there was no good way to answer that question without admitting bias. Karoline continued, her voice steady. "I don't create controversy. I speak the truth. And if that truth makes some people uncomfortable, maybe it's because they don't want to face it." Another murmur from the audience. The host clenched his jaw slightly, flipping through his notes, searching for a way to regain control. "Let's move on," he said quickly. Karoline simply smiled. She had won this round again. The host was out of options. His attempts to regain control had failed. His carefully scripted narrative had collapsed, and the audience could feel it. Desperation crept into his voice. "Well, Karoline, surely you can admit that perspectives like yours contribute to division." Karoline cut him off, her voice sharp. "No, what divides this country isn't people like me. It's people like you. People who twist facts, manipulate words, and push an agenda while pretending to be neutral. You don't ask questions, you push narratives. And when someone like me refuses to play along, you scramble to regain control." The studio went silent. The host swallowed hard, his rehearsed charm now completely gone. He had walked into this interview thinking he would dismantle Karoline. Instead, she had dismantled him live on his own show. With an icy smile, she leaned back in her chair. "You wanted a debate. You got one. But you didn't expect to lose. Checkmate."